These days, upcoming MMA fighters can look to superstars like Conor McGregor or Israel Adesanya and dream of following their path to fame and fortune in a sport that is entrenched in the mainstream. But what inspired fighters to dedicate their lives to MMA back in the days before the sport was a global sensation and when even superstars at the top of their game couldn't earn millions of dollars? Turning your back on a normal career to lock yourself in cages and compete in brutal fights for a barely livable wage is a decision that some people would label crazy. And in the case of Jason Mayhem Miller, the subject of today's video, crazy is definitely an accurate description.
No, go back to my shit. Yo, no, it's fucking bullshit, man. No, man, you're fucking, that's what you think? That's what you fucking think? You're fucking laughing? You think it's hey, motherfucker, hey, man. Don't fucking tell me to rap. Man, you the told me to fucking do this shit. Yo, man, you fucking do this?
No disrespect. No disrespect. I'm just with you.
Yeah.
You gotta
The story of Mayhem Miller includes public freakouts, embarrassing mugshots, infamous brawls, public embarrassment, hosting a hit MTV show, and a dramatic standoff with a SWAT team, to name just a few aspects of the story of MMA's most erratic star. Through a mixture of good fighting skill and a ridiculous and over-the-top personality that was way ahead of its time, Mayhem Miller managed to build a huge profile for himself. With a thriving MMA career, legions of fans, and his own MTV show, Mayhem Miller should have been positioned to build a life that early 2000s MMA fighters could only dream of. And yet in the space of just 2 years, his MMA career would completely fall apart, and he would enter a disastrous spiral of addiction that saw him destroy his life and reputation with a shocking number of arrests and scandals, which he is still trying to rebuild from to this day. This video tells the story of the insane rise and fall of one of MMA's biggest mavericks, Jason Mayhem Miller, from his humble beginnings to the fame and riches and the subsequent downfall that cost him everything. But before we dive into the very public details of Jason Mayhem Miller's life, I want to tell you about a tool that can help you with safeguarding your own privacy. A massive thank you to NordVPN for helping to make this video possible by being today's sponsor. NordVPN specializes in the business of keeping you safe online. Their fastest in the market VPN allows you to keep your data and location private, and their built-in threat protection tool goes even further by protecting you against malware and malicious trackers from dodgy websites and downloaded files. But NordVPN doesn't just keep you safe online, it can also help with accessing content not available in your country. Whether you're going on your travels this summer, or you just want to watch content only available in other countries, by changing your location with NordVPN, you're able to access content libraries from around the world. For example, by changing my VPN location to the UK, I can access BBC iPlayer and watch documentaries that were otherwise unavailable to me. I can confidently say that NordVPN is by far the best VPN I've used in both speed and breadth of features, and if you're looking for a VPN, I would strongly recommend using Nord. If you want to try NordVPN, then check it out at nordvpn.com/Narera linked below. Using my link helps to support the channel, but will also get you an extra 4 months free with any 2-year plan. So please check out nordvpn.com/Narera linked below. Now, let's get into the video. Long before Jason Miller would grace the UFC octagon and bring MMA content to the masses through hosting MTV's Bully Beatdown, he was just another troubled kid trying to find his passion in life. Born and raised in Fort Bragg, North Carolina to a military family, Miller was a self-described idiot kid who was prone to getting into fights and causing trouble at the slightest provocation. Jason Miller did not fit in at school, and those who attended with him back in the day describe him as a strange kid with an insatiable thirst for fighting. And it was his thirst for fighting that would get him kicked out of the school and force his parents to move 40 miles away to a new school district just to allow him to attend school. One positive of this change in school was that Mayhem Miller would discover high school wrestling and finally found an outlet to channel his extreme aggression. But wrestling alone wasn't enough to satisfy his lust for violence, and before long he was trying out other martial arts disciplines with pretty poor results. He began by trying out karate, but struggled to understand the concept of a karate school, and instead was intent on trying to fight everyone in there, including the instructors, rather than learn anything. Unsurprisingly, the middle-aged local karate instructors were not trying to fight hell for leather with a crazy teenager, and Mayhem was asked to leave the school and not come back. With karate no longer an option, Jason would decide to take up judo, and he lasted a little longer in judo class, but again, he had very little interest in learning and was more interested in fighting and sparring. The overzealous Jason Miller would accidentally break a fellow student's nose, causing the instructor to realize that this wild child was not a fit for his low-level hobbyist judo class. The judo instructor would cancel Miller's membership, but not before he gave a suggestion that would change the course of Jason Miller's life forever. Miller's judo instructor would tell the turbulent teenager that if he wanted to be a fighter so bad, then he should go and join a mixed martial arts gym located not too far from the judo school. Banned from the remainder of judo class, Jason Miller would hop on his bike and head for the mythical gym, and although it was closed by the time he arrived, a peek through the window revealed a treasure trove of MMA posters, with the walls adorned with pictures of UFC legends like Frank Shamrock and Royce Gracie. Immediately, Miller knew he had found exactly what he was looking for, but he had no idea just how impactful this gym would be on the direction of his life. By Mayhem Miller's own account, this gym wasn't much to write home about in terms of high-quality coaching. Miller would recount in an interview with MMA Fighting that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was taught by a guy who learned submissions from a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu DVD. A man called Boo Boo provided boxing lessons, and a quote, fat dude who used to be in the army would also show up occasionally to help. But one thing that was perfect about the gym was the sparring, which was noted as particularly hard-hitting, and Jason Miller could not get enough, spending as much time as he possibly could at the gym for an entire summer. Miller would keep up this training as he went back to high school for his senior year and slowly but surely began to improve. But he could only measure his progress against the guys in his gym. If he truly wanted to test himself, then he needed to have a real fight. At the age of just 17, the idea of fighting a fully grown man might have been intimidating for some. But for a guy like Jason Miller, who'd been looking for fights from the moment he could walk, there was no trepidation or fear. So when a fight opportunity in Virginia Beach paying $300 and a free hotel room reached him, he did not hesitate in agreeing to fight 27-year-old Al Superman Dill, even though the fight would fall on the date of his high school prom. While his schoolmates were donning their rented tuxedos and taking pictures in front of rented limos, Jason Miller was standing across the cage from a fully grown man getting ready to fight, with his high school girlfriend watching from cage side. His fight with Al Superman Dill would go the full scheduled 8 minutes in a fight Miller has described as very boring. But Mayhem Miller's high school wrestling prowess was enough to see Miller the man, or boy in this case, with his hand raised at the end of the fight. High on adrenaline, Miller knew that this feeling and this environment was the one that he was destined to thrive in, and he would do whatever it took to make professional fighting his life. Even though in 1998, the path of a professional MMA fighter was relatively untested and not particularly lucrative. Despite the uncertain future of the sport, Miller would drop everything and go all in, and he would go on to never hold a regular job for the rest of his life. Those around him at the time would cast doubt on his ambitions, with his girlfriend completely unimpressed, and his dad enraged at the idea of his son foregoing college in favor of trying to make a career in a barely established sport. But Mayhem Miller was not the kind of kid to change his mind, and the end result of his arguments with his dad was his dad calling him an idiot and kicking him out of the house for good, leaving Jason Miller to pursue his MMA dreams on his own. Miller packed everything he owned into a van and hit the road, living the van life before it was popular. He would eventually arrive in Atlanta, find an MMA gym, park his van outside the gym, and live there for the foreseeable future, completely broke and attending as many classes as he possibly could. Still extremely young, his dedicated lifestyle of essentially living at the gym and training as much as possible would provide the perfect foundation for a career in MMA. But it was a huge risk to gamble his life on a career in a sport that was struggling badly. With America's biggest MMA promotion, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, or UFC, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy and hemorrhaging money until it was saved by Zuffa in 2001. Ironically, the same year that an unknown kid named Jason Mayhem Miller would make his professional MMA debut and begin his path to MMA stardom. As previously mentioned, Mayhem Miller had already made his MMA debut on the night of his high school prom, and since that night, he had gone on to have several very low-level fights in his adopted home of Atlanta, Georgia. But given the primitive state of MMA at the time, none of these were captured by record keepers and have been lost to time.
I come from a time where we fought in these like underground type tournaments, even before the TV deals and whatnot. They had these crazy like underground events that, you know, I really padded my record over there.
Given MMA's lack of development, Mayhem Miller's commitment to training and broadening his game would give him a serious advantage in these low-level fights against barely trained opponents.
Mostly, like, because I lived in Atlanta for a big part of my career, early days. You know, jiu-jitsu was like just bursting onto the scene, so it'd be me against some wild redneck that didn't know any jiu-jitsu, and I could just magically ham him up real quick. It was a crazy time.
By the time Miller had a fight that would actually count towards his record, he had been training intensely for several years and was more than ready, notching up a win in his debut and quickly jumping out to a 3-0 professional record aged just 20. But it was at this point that he was offered a fight against a certain unbeaten grappler hailing from the ghettos of West Lynn, Oregon. With apparent Narera Fight Stories viewer Chael P. Sonnen the opponent offered for a bout in Tito Ortiz's promotion, Hitman Fighting Productions. Chael was only 1-0 at the time, but brought to the bout significant wrestling pedigree from a college career that saw him earn All-American honors. Chael Sonnen has recounted the events of this fight on his own YouTube channel, with absolutely bizarre scenes occurring, which saw the fight having to be stopped after a Chael Sonnen takedown on Miller made the ring give way, which caused Miller to fall down a hole. Yes, seriously. There is video of this fight and the takedown itself, but you can't see Miller fall in the hole, and the video suspiciously cuts away right after the takedown. After a prolonged break, the promoter announced that he was unable to fix the ring and just asked the fighters to try and avoid the spot with the big hole. Early era MMA. If you look at the beginning of the second round, you can see just how much the mat moves as Chael moves over the broken area. Despite these antics, Chael would use his college wrestling prowess to score a number of takedowns on Mayhem, and he was the deserved winner. A disappointing night for Mayhem Miller, losing to a less experienced opponent, considering at the time he had no idea the fighter that Chael Sonnen would go on to become. But in hindsight, this loss would age well, as Sonnen went on to become a serious contender at the highest levels of the game. That first taste of defeat far from deterred Mayhem Miller in committing himself to the fight game. Having relocated from Atlanta and moving to California, he plowed on with fighting often, picking up 2 wins in the next few months. He would then return to Atlanta to fight a man he'd previously beaten in Todd Carney, but he would come unstuck after refusing to tap and getting put to sleep to leave his record at 5 wins and 2 defeats. A determined competitor, Miller demanded and was granted the trilogy fight with Carney, and after 6 months of preparation, he would absolutely smoke him, with Carney's corner throwing in the towel in the very first round. The determination Miller was showing at this part of his career was the fuel that would propel him to the heights and fame that he would eventually reach. With his abundance of energy and addictive personality, channeled towards training and improving his game by any means necessary. But in much the same way as his addictive personality could change his life positively, if channeled in the wrong way, it had the potential to ruin his life. And this is a battle he has been fighting his entire life, from his early days as a high school delinquent to the present day. But for now, he was completely focused on mixed martial arts, highlighted by him entering a 2-round tournament just 3 weeks after starching Carney, picking up another win in the semi-final before he would lose the final to future UFC contender Tim Kennedy, putting his record at 7 wins and 3 losses. Given that Jason Miller wasn't fighting at the highest levels of the game yet, a 7-3 record could be seen as disappointing. But given that he had avenged his loss to Todd Carney, and both Chael Sonnen and Tim Kennedy would go on to become respected UFC contenders, his record was actually much better than it appeared. It might not have seemed like it at the time, but Mayhem Miller was about to break out and become a bigger star than anyone could have ever imagined. powered by his insatiable appetite for fighting and an outlandish personality that would see him branch out in ways other fighters didn't even believe to be possible at the time. After losing to Tim Kennedy, Mayhem Miller remained active and kept fighting, picking up a couple of wins, including some against Askar Majarov-level opponents. But in fairness to Miller, at this stage of MMA, it was more about fighting as often as possible to put money in your pocket, rather than a nefarious attempt to manipulate his record. Though he did improve his record from 7-3 to 11-3 with a couple of pretty bad fights. But equally impactful as his record improving was the reputation that Mayhem Miller was developing for himself as an entertaining fighter and a colourful guy with a zany personality that helped him to stand out. These days, it's almost a given that a fighter needs some sort of personality or charisma to stand out, but back in the early 2000s, it was a lot less common. But being charismatic and ultimately memorable was something that came naturally to Miller, who was never too concerned with what people thought about him. And that included Dana White, who was both aware of and apparently disliked Mayhem Miller before he'd even gotten to the UFC. This combination of solid fighting skills and a personality would put Mayhem Miller's name on a level that perhaps might be unexpected for a guy who was yet to fight for the era's biggest promotions, with the UFC having already once tried to put together a fight between Mayhem Miller and an unknown bold Canadian bloke named Georges St. Pierre. But in an ominous foreshadowing of the collapse of his life, this fight with GSP would fall through due to unspecified legal issues on Miller's part, causing him to lose the chance to fight in front of 10,000 fans for the UFC. But Miller bounced back from this setback with a perfect night by winning against a very experienced opponent in Ronald Hoon, and then hitting the headlines and building some notoriety thanks to the massive brawl that occurred in the ring after Miller had tapped out his opponent. During the fracas, Miller was punched in the back of the head by rival fighter Mark Moreno. Mayhem Miller was way ahead of his time, and he would pepper Mark Moreno with insults via the MMA media, building up a grudge match that would get booked but fell through due to injury. But after this fight fell through, Mayhem's phone would ring again, and Dana White's dislike for him was outweighed by how much he wanted to see Miller get beaten up, and the fight with GSP was rebooked for UFC 52. GSP, at 8 wins and 1 defeat, entered the fight as the slight favourite, but he would show his undeniable greatness by completely dominating Mayhem Miller, landing all 5 of his takedowns and outlanding Miller 64-16 in significant strikes. To Miller's credit, he did take the fight the distance, but the outcome on the cards was never in doubt, and GSP was the unanimous winner. This loss was a huge blow for Mayhem, as the UFC, perhaps unaware at the time of just how special a fighter GSP was, would cut Miller immediately, and he would not make a UFC return for a staggering 6 years. To get your chance on the big stage and get thoroughly outclassed and then fired may have dented the ambitions or confidence of other fighters, but for someone as driven and committed as Mayhem Miller, it was just another bump in the road, and he would dive back into action as soon as possible. With his grudge match against Mark Moreno, the guy who had punched him in the back of the head, rebooked for just 2 months after he lost to GSP. This fight may not have been in the UFC, but make no mistake about it, there was a buzz for it, especially in Hawaii where the fight would take place. Having fought in Hawaii numerous times, Miller, with his wild antics and colourful personality, had established himself as a Super Brawl promotion fan favourite. The fight may have been a grudge match, but it wasn't a close one, with Miller inflicting some GSP-style dominance onto Moreno, with almost the entire fight being Miller having ground control and landing strikes, before submitting Moreno with an armbar 5 seconds before the end of the first round. Miller would let him have it after the fight with a taunt referencing the punch to the back of the head, but they would make up in the end, and it was an impressive night's work just 2 months after GSP had beaten him badly enough to get him fired by the UFC. Miller would go on a run from here, picking up 3 wins in a row before getting his next tough test against a future UFC great in none other than ruthless Robbie Lawler, a name that should be familiar to every MMA fan on the planet. This was a fight between 2 guys who had both been cut by the UFC after not making the grade, with Lawler losing 3 of his last 4 fights in the UFC before getting cut. During his walkout, Miller would flash his outlandish showman personality that was beginning to generate him a significant fan base dubbed the Mayhem Monkeys, with a Bob Marley themed entrance that the crowd in Hawaii loved, and a ridiculous haircut, something that would become a staple of his career and ultimately his life for the wrong reasons. Miller would go on to win this fight with Lawler, surviving a troublesome period in the second round during which Lawler laid down serious ground and pound. Lawler expended a lot of energy in the second round, and the ever-committed Mayhem Miller was more than ready for the final round. As a tired Lawler staggered into the third round, Mayhem Miller leapt on him like a rabid dog, landing a few strikes, taking him down, and submitting him with an arm triangle choke.
Another kick, a haymaker right from Mayhem Miller. He's got it in, and he holds it. Has to squeeze. And he finished it. There's the 10. There's the 10. Miller is the champ.
An amazing win for Mayhem Miller, considering the legendary run Lawler would later have in the UFC. But Mayhem would struggle to follow up on this result, losing his next fight to Frank Trigg, seemingly unable to put together a win streak long enough to recapture the attention of the UFC, even after avenging his loss against Tim Kennedy. However, Mayhem Miller had been successful in capturing the attention of Japanese promotion Dream, and he would fight multiple times in Japan, with his time there characterized by his ridiculous entrances that underscored why Mayhem had managed to develop quite the fan base, irregardless of the stage he was fighting on. But his time in Japan would see him pick up his 5th loss and the end of his 4-fight win streak, with Mayhem losing a unanimous decision to Jacare Souza. By this point, Mayhem had established himself as a high-level fighter who perhaps lacked the skill to be #1 in the world at his weight class. But being one of the best middleweights in the world was by itself a fantastic achievement. But given that this was in 2008, it was also a fairly daunting place to be, as Mayhem wasn't earning enough from fighting to live the high life, and he was failing to make it back to the UFC. But one thing that Mayhem had always done well was brand himself, both at his fights, but also importantly through social media, where he was an early adopter of platforms such as MySpace, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. He might not look it, but Mayhem Miller has described himself as something of a geek, who was always in touch with the latest technology trends. Long before most people were using social media to boost their profile, Mayhem was harnessing its power to display his crazy personality and build a cult-like fan base dubbed the Mayhem Monkeys, who couldn't get enough of the cage fighter with boundless energy and no filter. And it was his outsized personality rather than his fighting that would land Jason Miller the biggest opportunity of his life, through unconventional means that were unheard of for MMA stars in the early 2000s. This opportunity would give Mayhem both money and the chance to blow his reputation up to levels high enough that the UFC couldn't possibly keep ignoring him. And it all started because MTV needed a cage fighter with a personality capable of hosting a brand new reality TV show, Bully Beatdown. The year is 2009, and Mark Burnett Productions, the brains behind popular shows such as The Apprentice, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader, and Survivor, had created an idea for a new reality TV show. The premise of the show was fairly simple. The producers would find someone who was being bullied, tell their story, and then confront the bully in question, offering the bully the chance to win $10,000 by fighting against a professional MMA fighter. The money the bully won was dependent on how well they survived against the professional fighter, with any of the $10,000 prize that the bully didn't win being given to their victim. The bully's fight was split into 2 rounds, with the first round being a 3-minute grappling-only round in which the bully would lose $1,000 every time they tapped. The second round was a 3-minute striking round in which the bully would earn $5,000 if they managed to survive the round without getting knocked out or the ref stopping in to save them. This was a fairly out there concept that had the potential to either be a smash hit or an embarrassing flop, and for the show to hit its full potential, it needed a host who was both a martial artist but also entertaining enough to head up a reality TV show and bring the bully victim stories to life. The producers, in their search for a host, happened to stumble upon the YouTube of a certain Jason Mayhem Miller, with the producers so impressed with what they saw that Mayhem was offered the Bully Beatdown host role without even needing to audition. Landing an MTV hosting role was a huge deal at the time, given that MTV hadn't quite fell off into the showing ridiculousness all day every day phase that they currently find themselves in. Within months of being named host, the first season was shot and began to air on MTV, with Mayhem Miller the man chosen to introduce reality TV form of MMA to hundreds of thousands of people who had never watched the sport before. Miller as the host would prove to be an inspired choice by MTV, with they show a massive success from its very first episode, which aired in March 2009, earning 1.4 million viewers and being the #1 rated program in its time slot among male viewers aged 35 or lower, the exact audience that MTV had desperately wanted to target with this show. Miller's performance as host received rave reviews from viewers, and the first season went extremely well, with the show ranking as one of MTV's biggest at the time. While it's not exactly Breaking Bad or The Sopranos, Bully Beatdown is a very easy watch and fairly entertaining, with season 1 also including the only episode that saw the bully walk away with the full $10,000 prize when professional MMA fighter Thomas Denny, who had previously fought against the likes of GSP and Nick Diaz, failed to tap out the bully once, and then in the second round failed to finish him. A fairly humiliating accomplishment. Given Bully Beatdown's success, it was unsurprisingly very quickly renewed for a second season, and its popularity gave Mayhem Miller an unprecedented boost in popularity, allowing him to become one of the most well-known MMA fighters in America, even if a lot of his fanbase was a more casual audience than MMA fanatics. While filming for Bully Beatdown, Miller would continue his fight career, which meant that his schedule was absolutely brutal, with long days of training and filming, but it paid off with the second season airing with stellar results. The show was slightly down on the success of the first season, but it averaged over 800,000 viewers per episode. But the longer the show went on, it would begin to run into some issues, with accusations by critics that the show was staged and the supposed bullying between the bully and their victims was just a ruse to sell the show. These accusations did the rounds on forums and into Jason Miller's comment sections, with people suggesting the bullies were actually paid stuntmen and the whole show was fake. Miller was quick to jump to Bully Beatdown's defense, stating that you cannot fake someone getting beaten up, and claiming that all of the bullies used in the show were real, and they were just arrogant enough to think that they could beat up a pro fighter. In reality, given we're now more than a decade past the show airing, it's become pretty clear that while some episodes of the show may have been legitimate, the producers did take significant liberties with the truth. If we take the episode with the bully who actually survived his fight and won the whole $10,000 prize, for example, we can find a comment from someone purporting to be Dennis the Bully, in which he states that the two supposed victims he'd been bullying were actually his friends, and he just wanted to be on the show to make $10K to put towards paramedic school. But if a YouTube comment doesn't seem like good proof, there is much better proof that the show was fake. Former UFC champion Eddie Alvarez was one of a long line of great MMA fighters who appeared on the show as the fighter to beat up the bully, and he would recount his experience on the show with Chael Sonnen.
So I beat my guy up, and then like afterwards I couldn't help myself. I go up to him and I'm like, dude, you're like 32. Why are you bullying people?
Right.
And he goes, I don't even know them.
Oh, no!
So
It appears that a lot of the bullies were recruited on the basis of being offered to fight a pro MMA fighter for $10K, with the background bullying story being created after they'd been intrigued by the fight offer. Far different to how it was portrayed on the show. But this was MTV, and all of their reality TV shows are fake as hell, so who really cares? The show was dumb enough to be entertaining, and I think even bringing it back in 2024, the format could work if the bullies were replaced by internet trolls. Given the second season had been a strong success, MTV would order a third series to be made shortly after, and it would begin airing in late 2010. Again producing fairly solid viewership numbers and cementing Mayhem as a huge MMA star for the time. But when the third season ended, the show was surprisingly not renewed, for reasons that are unclear. Perhaps MTV felt the format was getting stale and viewership, while solid, was declining. Or perhaps accusations of the show being fake and staged had began to ruin the product. But either way, after a successful 3-series run on one of America's biggest TV channels, Bully Beatdown was no more. Bully Beatdown remains to this day an underground hit, and featured future MMA stars like Daniel Cormier, the aforementioned Andrei Arlovski and Eddie Alvarez, as well as Tyron Woodley, as just some of the fighters brought in to beat up the bullies. If you're ever bored, there are worse ways to spend half an hour than watching an episode of Bully Beatdown. The show had given Mayhem Miller a massive platform and fan base that he further cultivated through his social media presence. And even though he'd been busy with filming for Bully Beatdown for more than 2 years, someone as obsessed with fighting as Mayhem Miller was hardly going to put MMA on the back burner, and he regularly fought during his time as Bully Beatdown host. And the notoriety and name recognition that the show had given Mayhem Miller was about to allow him to move from small shows in Hawaii to the American MMA mainstream, but surprisingly, not for the UFC just yet. Being the host of a hit MTV show had allowed Mayhem to earn more money than he had ever made off of fighting, and it could have been tempting to get a bit lazy and just focus on his TV work, leaving fighting as something that he did on the side. But Mayhem Miller took the Sigma grindset approach, and instead, he went as hard as ever in his MMA career. Miller continued fighting regularly, including a highly anticipated rematch with Jacare Souza in Dream, but this fight would not go to plan, with it ending in a no contest as a result of an illegal kick from Mayhem Miller that left an enraged Jacare with a large cut. Mayhem had failed to get his revenge on Jacare, but given this fight took place during season 1 of Bully Beatdown, the result barely mattered as his profile was shooting through the roof, with thousands of new fans arriving via MTV. This army of casual fans backing Mayhem Miller thanks to his charismatic personality and wild persona on the show made him a potential huge asset for any major North American promotion, whether that was the UFC or someone trying to wrestle the crown away from the UFC. And it just so happened that the launch of Bully Beatdown coincided with a major attempt to wrestle North American MMA market share away from the UFC, with this new contender desperately needing star power to bolster their chances against the UFC juggernaut. After a few years of operating as a largely regional promotion, Scott Coker's Strikeforce MMA decided that the time was right to start making inroads into becoming a national force, and they began to sign several top-level fighters to their roster, including the likes of Nick Diaz, Jake Shields, and ex-Mayhem opponent Robbie Lawler. This infusion of talent was funded in large part by a groundbreaking deal Strikeforce agreed with Showtime and CBS that would see several Strikeforce events a year broadcasted to a national audience on CBS. A massive opportunity and a potential threat to Dana White and the UFC. But Coker and Strikeforce were not done there, as just a few months after landing the CBS contract, Strikeforce agreed a partnership with Japanese promotion Dream that would allow for fighter exchanges between the promotions, meaning fighters such as Shinya Aoki, Jacare Souza, Gegard Mousasi, and crucially, the host of the hit TV show Bully Beatdown, a certain Jason Mayhem Miller. Yes, Strikeforce was not the UFC, but the potential of fighting in front of a national American audience on CBS was an opportunity that Mayhem had yet to receive in his career, and Strikeforce did not lack in ambition, with the signing of a certain Fedor Emelianenko underlining their ambition, with Mayhem Miller's first fight in Strikeforce coming as chief support to the Russian big man's Strikeforce debut. And Strikeforce showed the faith and belief they had in Miller by handing him a shot at the vacant middleweight title in his debut against Jake Shields live on CBS. Jake Shields was a fighter who had appeared in the first season of Bully Beatdown, with the Bully winning $2,000 of the potential $10,000 prize. While he didn't get a clean sweep on Bully Beatdown, Jake Shields was no mug, with a record of 24 wins to just 4 losses, and a fearsome ground game that allowed him to absolutely maul guys. Mayhem had crumbled on the big stage before, but he would deliver one of the best performances of his entire career, with the fight going the full 25-minute distance. There was a wild moment in round 3 in which Mayhem came just seconds away from winning the belt as he locked in a perfect choke on Shields, who was banged to rights, but the bell would sound just moments before Shields was about to fall unconscious. When it came time for the judge's decision at the end of 5 rounds, it was Jake Shields who would see his hand raised in a decision that was loudly booed by fans in attendance who felt that Mayhem had done enough to earn the title. To come so close to a title in a major promotion like Strikeforce was heartbreaking. However, in front of perhaps the biggest audience of his career, and while still riding the crest of the Bully Beatdown wave, Miller had won even more fans with a commendable performance. Aged just 28, you would think that Mayhem had plenty left in the tank and his career would continue to move forward. But in retrospect, this was arguably the peak of his career, given how close he came to winning the belt and how popular he was at the time. Things would begin to trend downwards after this fight, and his career would fall off a cliff over the next few years. Mayhem had lost the fight, but this was not the last that Jake Shields would see of him, with an infamous incident occurring between the two that would send shockwaves around the MMA community and jeopardize the entire Strikeforce promotion in the process. Mayhem's next fight would come on a card headlined by Jake Shields, with Miller recording a round 1 win over Tim Stout. Given that he'd already won, Miller could have called it a night and gone out to celebrate. But ever the promoter, he stuck around to watch Shields record a decision win over Dan Henderson, before making the wild decision to get in the cage to interrupt Shields' interview and demand a rematch. Considering Jake Shields had the Diaz brothers and Gilbert Melendez in his corner, this was a very bad decision by Mayhem, and Shields' team showed very little hesitation in jumping Mayhem Miller live on CBS and causing complete chaos. The Strikeforce Nashville brawl would have disastrous consequences for the promotion, as it was embarrassing for the broadcaster to be associated with, and when combined with a poor rating, it was the nail in the coffin for Strikeforce's relationship with CBS. A relationship that Scott Coker had gambled on being the key ingredient for the success of Strikeforce. The criticism for Miller from this incident was coming from all corners, with even Dana White taking a shot at the goofball, as he would call him.
And you get goofball, hey, where's my rematch running in his, what do you think's going to happen? And I saw people talking saying, well, the UFC does the same thing. No, we don't. First of all,
with bridges burnt between Mayhem and Strikeforce, he would return to his home promotion of Dream, fighting in Japan against legendary fighter Kazushi Sakuraba, who was admittedly coming to the end of his career at this point, but take nothing away from Miller, who finished Sakuraba in just 1 round. Mayhem's record stood at an impressive 23 wins and 7 losses, with most of these losses against fighters who would go on to prove they were elite, like GSP, Chael Sonnen, and Jacare Souza. Mayhem had an absolutely massive fan base, was good enough to be a top contender, and had some scorching hot rivalries that could be exploited by promoters. He should have had the best years of his MMA career ahead of him, and yet instead, we would witness the dramatic downward spiral of Mayhem Miller's life unfold. From this point onwards, Mayhem Miller would never win a fight again, and in fact, he would have more arrests than fights left in his career. An absolute tragedy for someone who was not even 30 years old. And bizarrely, the beginning of this rapid downfall would start at the same time as shifting sands in MMA presented him with an even bigger stage to perform on, as addiction to training made way to addiction to alcohol and drugs, and mayhem in the cage turned into mayhem outside of the cage, ruining his career, reputation, and life. After years of trying to go toe-to-toe with the UFC and largely failing, Scott Coker and Strikeforce finally had to throw in the towel after several years of burning way more money than they were earning. Mayhem Miller had done his part in helping to finish Strikeforce by helping to ruin the relationship with CBS, but even if he hadn't done that, the damage was done because of just how much money was being paid out to fighters versus the money that those fighters were drawing in, highlighted by the massive contract that Coker handed to Fedor Emelianenko that ran into the millions of dollars per fight. In 2010, while the UFC was paying its fighters 22% of gross revenue, Strikeforce was paying an astonishing 72.5% of gross revenue to fighters. Completely unsustainable numbers, and something had to give. After soldiering on for a couple of years, Strikeforce's position became desperate, and with shareholders looking to exit the business, Coker was forced to look for a buyer for a promotion that he'd been running for almost 3 decades, back to the days when it was just a regional kickboxing promotion. And despite Scott Coker previously vowing to never sell to his rivals in the UFC, he was eventually forced into accepting their offer and officially waving the white flag. The UFC would continue operating the Strikeforce brand for the rest of the Strikeforce's Showtime deal, after which the brand would be folded under the UFC and fighters' contracts moved across. But in the meantime, the brand continued on under UFC control for 2 more years and maintained most of its roster until the final show in 2013. But one of the Strikeforce roster who would not continue with the promotion until the final card was Mayhem Miller. Since playing his part in the Strikeforce Nashville Brawl, Miller had been on the shelf, instead appearing in Dream against Sakuraba, and over time his Strikeforce contract had actually ended up expiring, making him a free agent. Despite Mayhem Miller's belief that Dana White hated him, and Dana White clearly thinking Jason Miller was an idiot after the Strikeforce Nashville Brawl, the UFC would decide to make the move to sign Mayhem, who was still very popular, adding his star power to a stacked middleweight division in April of 2011. The UFC were quick to book his first fight, with a bout against Aaron Simpson scheduled for July of that year. But this fight would be replaced in favor of a much bigger opportunity of being a coach on a season of The Ultimate Fighter against Mike Bisping. If Miller could come in and beat a contender like Bisping in his second UFC debut, it would have allowed him to jump most of the queue in the middleweight division and make serious inroads towards a title shot. Someone in the UFC clearly believed in him and his star power, and they were handing him the biggest spotlight of his MMA career before he'd even had a fight on his new deal, hoping to kickstart a memorable Mayhem UFC run. But under the bright lights of the UFC, Mayhem Miller completely and utterly unraveled in devastating fashion, and his inability to cope with his struggles would ruin his life. But there were signs of trouble before his UFC career had even suffered any setbacks. Mayhem Miller's addictive personality had seen him spend most of his career obsessed with training and getting better. But being as rich as he'd ever been in his life, it appears that his addictive personality was beginning to center on less productive habits like drinking alcohol and doing drugs. In August 2011, just months before he was due to start filming his series of The Ultimate Fighter, Mayhem was arrested in North Carolina at a house party on charges of simple assault and false imprisonment, with the victim being his sister. These were fairly serious charges, but Mayhem must have felt they were either overblown or unserious, as he would make a tweet poking fun at the situation not long after the arrest. Getting arrested did not impact his Ultimate Fighter coaching spot, and the series went on as planned, with Mayhem pitted against a Michael Bisping who was yet to establish himself as the likable figure that he is seen as today. As is standard in The Ultimate Fighter, the culmination of the series would be a fight between the coaches, with Miller and Bisping squaring off for Miller's second UFC debut in December 2011. Bisping was the favorite by a distance, but Miller was still very popular and was decidedly the fan favorite. In his last UFC fight, Mayhem was completely outclassed in every department by the legendary Georges St. Pierre, and he was brutally fired shortly after that, with Dana White and company not viewing him as UFC level. After 6 years away from the UFC, this was Mayhem's big shot at redemption, and well, it was a complete and utter disaster. Michael Bisping would win via TKO in the third round of one of the most lopsided UFC main events possibly ever, with a one-sided beatdown for 3 rounds before the fight was mercifully stopped. This wasn't just a bad performance from Miller, it was a horrific one. This fight was just the second time that the durable Mayhem Miller had ever been stopped in a more than 30 fight long career, and he had once again looked like a fish out of water in the UFC. The reaction to this fight was brutal, with many fans and media calling for Miller to be cut from the UFC immediately. Luckily for Mayhem, his famously shy and supportive boss Dana White was in his corner, going easy on him by labeling the fight the most one-sided fight ever in the UFC and calling Mayhem a quote punching bag with the worst stand-up that he has ever seen in his life. Good old Dana White. Despite the widespread calls to fire Mayhem on the spot, and even after his boss absolutely roasted him, the UFC would stand by Jason Miller and keep him in the promotion, with a shot at redemption booked in a fight against CB Dollaway to take place in May 2012. Mayhem knew that he was in the last chance saloon, and he wasn't shy about it either, vowing to retire immediately if he couldn't beat Dollaway.
If I cannot perform in the octagon, then I shouldn't be there. That's just the truth. You know what I mean? That's just the cold hard facts. Is that if I can be a superstar in practice and then not show what I can do in the cage, then what's the point? I might as well just hang out in the gym and help the guys.
The confidence was there, but sometimes things just aren't meant to be, and Mayhem Miller and the UFC were clearly not meant to be. In the battle of the world's worst haircuts, the 31-year-old Miller would drop Holloway in the very first minute of round 1, but tragically, he would injure his knee, massively hampering him for the rest of the fight. To his credit, Mayhem would fight on and give it everything he had, flashing the determination and addiction to competing that had brought him to the UFC, but he was clearly compromised, and unable to give his best performance, he would lose the fight on the scorecards by unanimous decision, in a hammer blow of a defeat. Mayhem had vowed to retire from MMA if he lost to Holloway, but that didn't mean he had to stick with his decision. He could take the time to weigh up his options and then decide whether... Oh, never mind, the UFC fired him the very next day. Miller's performance in the UFC hadn't been up to scratch, but that alone wasn't the reason the UFC was so quick to let him go, with backstage antics including an altercation with a UFC official being the reason he was fired so quickly.
But come on, man, take this thing serious. You want to be a clown, you can do that later. Do that on your reality show, but I don't know. Then something happened here backstage after Mayhem's done. He's gone.
What happened?
Just some bullshit that I don't want to talk about.
Bringing to an end a genuinely disastrous run, with his overall UFC record being 0 wins and 3 losses, and his time in the UFC octagon contained some of the worst performances of his entire career. At this point, after building himself a career that most fighters would have been envious of, it seemed like Miller had completely blown it. But aged just 31, was it really over yet? Could he forge a miraculous comeback and go on to prove Dana and the UFC wrong? Well, no. Absolutely not. Things would get so much worse so fast after the end of his UFC run, and before long, competing in mixed martial arts at the top level again was the least of his concerns. Mayhem was not a stupid guy, and he was beginning to sense that his MMA career was slipping away, and having dedicated his entire adult life to fighting, and with no clear future ahead of him, he began to struggle massively to deal with it all.
I don't know, a really dark period. There's no... once you lose fights, get injured, and your resources kind of dry up where you don't have the management and this kind of thing, it's really difficult to navigate from the fight world. Where do you go? To the normal world? Like, what's normal after you've done all that? So I had like a really challenging time trying to figure my way up out of that. And I was kind of disillusioned by mixed martial arts a little bit because, the way it, the glory had kind of faded. And I went through this phase of being like very kind of pissed off at the world a little bit. And I guess that's like a normal thing that happens to athletes when you fell out of your usefulness as far as, being an active fighter. But then,
to numb the pain of accepting the fact that he was declining in the one skill he had drawn his self-worth and self-confidence from, Mayhem began to start abusing alcohol and substances on a regular basis, with a short-term approach to life that didn't take into account the impact that depending on alcohol and drugs could have on his life. The effects of replacing training and discipline with alcohol and drugs would be felt very quickly, and just 3 months after Mayhem Miller was cut from the UFC, California police were called to a church in Orange County after reports of a burglary in progress. When the police pulled up to the church, they were greeted by a completely naked Jason Miller lying on a sofa after spraying a fire extinguisher everywhere and trashing the church in a substance-fueled rampage. This was an embarrassing moment for Mayhem, but also potentially the most serious legal trouble he'd been in given his previous arrests. This arrest was accompanied by perhaps the last somewhat sane mugshot of Mayhem Miller, but it did feature him in the paper jumpsuit reserved for those arrested while naked. The fact intoxicated Miller had chosen a church to vandalize was sacrilegious behavior, but religious people can have a very forgiving side. And luckily for Miller, the pastor of the church was very forgiving, and instead of letting police press charges and potentially send Mayhem to jail, he would instead ask police to drop charges, believing that Mayhem could turn his life around with spiritual guidance instead. This was a noble thing to do, but in hindsight, it did not work out in the slightest. Still, For now at least, Mayhem had been given a lucky reprieve, and he was still benefiting from the juice of hosting Bully Beatdown, with Mayhem landing a movie role in Here Comes the Boom off the back of being one of the most recognizable MMA faces, a perfect fit for a movie all about fighting. Despite the fallout from his church arrest, Miller remained a part of the film, and 2 months after he was found butt naked and vandalizing a church, Mayhem was sent to the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani to promote the film. In Here Comes the Boom, which I have not and will not watch, I am reliably informed that Mayhem plays a character who used to be a famous MMA fighter but has fallen victim to his personal struggles, so basically he plays himself. Anyway, Mayhem arrived on the set for the MMA Hour, and for whatever bizarre reason, he decided to do the entire interview in character, which Helwani, who had interviewed Mayhem for years during his career, was obviously not interested in, asking him to just be normal. This would lead to Miller storming off the set with this infamous tantrum. The moment in and of itself was bad and went viral, but the entire interview was a complete train wreck that underlined the fact that Mayhem was falling off the rails and fast. Mercifully, after this embarrassing episode, Miller would disappear from the headlines for almost a year outside of the release of the film, and perhaps some of his Mayhem Monkey fans would have been praying that he was taking the time to get sober and work on making a comeback to the ring, given that he was still not that old. But Mayhem would leave any fans clamoring for a return to the cage disappointed, as he would instead return to the headlines with an arrest for domestic battery on August 11th, 2013. He was released on bail the next day, but then arrested again just 10 days later, and it was again for domestic battery. 2 charges of domestic violence in less than 2 weeks was a new low for the troubled fighter. He posted bail of $100,000, but he was quickly back in trouble with police in less than 2 months for violating his restraining order against his victim by sending her a Snapchat message, leading to contempt of court charges. Mayhem would again disappear from the public limelight for a year, presumably while awaiting trial. Unable to get any fights and unable to land gigs such as the analyst role he had once performed for Fox Sports, there wasn't exactly much for a guy like Miller to do, given he had never held a regular job in his life and had devoted everything to fighting. And this led to the toxic cycle of more substance and alcohol abuse, culminating in the most infamous arrest of his lengthy criminal record, with a wild standoff with a SWAT team. Mayhem had always been a prolific user of Twitter, and his legal issues hadn't exactly stopped that, as he continued to post throughout. But his tweets on October 9th, 2014 were a departure even from the usual Mayhem craziness. Miller had been due to appear in court for the domestic violence charge and restraining order breach from the previous year, but for whatever reason, he decided to completely skip court and as a result was declared a fugitive. Mayhem was not in hiding, and in fact he was just at home, but what could have been a peaceful arrest would turn into an intense standoff between Mayhem and the ever-increasing number of cops and SWAT team members, as Miller refused to come out and surrender and instead live-tweeted the entire saga to bemused followers and fans, with the story even reaching outside of the MMA community due to the absurdity of someone famous live tweeting while their home was surrounded by SWAT team members. Miller would initially bemoan the waste of resources, believing that the police had gone way overboard, but his tweets would eventually become more frenetic, with him begging police not to shoot him, claiming they were trying to murder him, and saying that he had done nothing wrong. The situation was so serious that the police genuinely brought in a crisis negotiation team, and friends of Mayhem from the MMA community would arrive on the scene begging him to surrender and end the protracted standoff. After nearly 5 hours, the SWAT team would decide to make a move and broke down the front door, successfully arresting Mayhem Miller without incident, ending what was an increasingly intense situation with concerns over the mental state of the former UFC fighter. This was a wild moment even for Mayhem Miller, and the story went viral, further broadcasting the tragic downfall of a man who once had the world at his feet. This time, Miller's bond was upped to $200K, and we got one of the more infamous cursed Jason Miller mugshot photos, showing a man clearly struggling to both beat his addictions and find a decent barber. Mayhem would eventually get out of jail, presumably posting bail, but before long he was back in trouble. In March 2015, Miller was arrested outside of a bar in Laguna Beach and was charged with battery, unlawful fighting, and resisting arrest in an incident caught on quite possibly the single worst camera that I have ever seen. Calling this even 144p seems generous, but here you go. By now the pattern of Mayhem's life was clear, and even his most ardent fans were beginning to view him as a lost cause. In October 2015, 6 months after his last arrest, Miller was arrested yet again, this time for assault after police were called to his house. Once police arrived to Mayhem's residence, he threw tiles at them and threatened them, resulting in police tasing him and arresting him. Next up on the criminal bingo card was a DUI charge 5 months later, and by now any hopes of an MMA comeback had surely evaporated. Or had they? As I've said on my videos covering some of Russian MMA's biggest scumbags, there is always a fight out there for you if you're infamous enough. 2 days after getting arrested for DUI, up-and-coming Italian promotion Venetor Fighting Championship thought, yes, this is the man who will take our promotion to the promised land. And they announced that Mayhem Miller had signed with the promotion and would be fighting in Italy within months. I am kinda surprised he could even get a visa or was allowed to leave America given the criminal charges he had, but whatever. This comeback fight was almost jeopardized though by, of course, another arrest, when Miller was arrested and charged in March 2016 for burglary and vandalism of a tattoo shop. But no worries guys, this incident actually occurred 2 months ago and before his DUI, so no worries, let's just go ahead with the fight. Perhaps there is a parallel universe where Miller takes this fight seriously, rolls back the years and wins in amazing fashion, and this spurs him to kick his addiction and make an MMA comeback and live happily ever after. But in the universe we actually live in, Mayhem would embarrass himself more than anyone even thought possible. I'm sure given the fact that he was fighting what felt like 30 cases and was averaging an arrest every 4 months, that there were serious doubts about Mayhem Miller's commitment to training. But he would surprise everyone with just how little of a f*** he actually gave, in a moment that lives down in MMA infamy. Mayhem had fought his career predominantly at 185 pounds, and this fight with Venetor FC was booked at 185 pounds against Luke Barnett. Easy enough, right? Well, up steps Miller to the scales and he weighs in at 209 pounds. He missed weight by 24 pounds. And the worst part is, he looks surprised on the scales and then decides to remove his shorts as if he's wearing 24-pound shorts. Like, what? Deary me, Jason Miller. Venetor now had to scramble to keep their biggest draw on the card, but with Miller's original opponent understandably refusing to fight him even after being offered 30% of Miller's purse and €5,000, they had to find an opponent on 24 hours notice to fight Jason Miller at his new weight of light heavyweight. Surprisingly, they succeeded and his fight was rebooked against Matthias Schiavolin. But unsurprisingly, Miller was in no fit state to give a good performance, and his second round loss via submission underlined the fact that he was absolutely finished as a fighter and had been reduced to a laughingstock whose only appearances in the headlines for the last few years had been for embarrassing incidents and arrests. A sad downfall from the highs of his career, and another bad weekend that made headlines across the MMA world. This embarrassing fight was followed by a string of further arrests, and 2 months after losing in Italy, Miller was back in cuffs in California, this time for 2 counts of assault and battery after an incident in a restaurant. In fairness, these charges would later be dismissed. And in November 2017, there was more good news for Mayhem, as the domestic violence case that had been hanging over his head for multiple years was finally resolved, with Miller pleading guilty and receiving a suspended sentence of 4 years in prison and 3 years probation, a very lucky outcome. Mayhem Miller was mercifully out of the headlines for a while after this and actually went 2 years without a single arrest. And those still keeping tabs on him or wondering what happened to Mayhem Miller may have begun to wonder if his problems were finally behind him. But they were not, and Miller was arrested again in October 2018 on charges of felony vandalism for damaging his girlfriend's home. A fairly bad incident, however not one you would expect to carry a long sentence given how lightly Miller had gotten away with domestic violence. But he was actually in deep trouble here, as due to violating probation and having prior charges, his possible sentence went from 8 months to a daunting 23 years in prison. Mayhem would initially plead not guilty to the charge, but with the prospect of 23 years behind bars dangling over him, he would opt to take the plea deal offered to him of just 1 year in prison with time served credited, meaning he was released back into the world in September 2019 after finally serving some time for the criminal rampage that had taken place since his MMA career began to fall apart. Perhaps serving a decent period behind bars could have straightened him out, but I regret to inform you that we are not yet at the bottom of the legal issues section of the Mayhem Miller Wikipedia page. And less than a year after his release, he was back causing, well, mayhem I guess, in California after copping charges of first-degree burglary and grand theft auto. Miller would again opt to take a plea deal for this charge, and he got a pathetic sentence of just 1 year behind bars with 2 years probation. Given Mayhem was arrested in August 2020 and got a 1 year sentence, we can assume that he was released around August 2021, a year later. And he wasted no time in getting back to being a moron, as in September 2021, less than 2 months after he was released, Mayhem was hit with yet another domestic violence charge after a dramatic incident that saw Miller lock himself in a bathroom when police arrived, with police forced to tase him so that they could arrest him. While in jail awaiting a court date for this latest charge, it would actually transpire that he'd committed another crime that same month, this one a felony assault and battery carried out in a California bar. Police had been called to the situation, but it had de-escalated by the time they arrived. But when the victim went home and discovered that Miller had broken his ribs, he decided to press charges, adding to Mayhem Miller's legal woes. Say what you want about Mayhem Miller's lack of intelligence, but one thing he was smart to do was decide to go on his crime spree in California, as these latest domestic violence and battery charges would land him a sentence of yet again just 1 year in prison. Mayhem would get his latest release from prison in May 2023, and seemingly came out of prison this time with a serious intention to try and turn his life around. To avoid spending time in bars and getting in trouble, he began dedicating more time to coaching fighters now that his career was in the past, with students of Miller attesting to him being a super genuine guy and a great coach. Unfortunately, while he seemed to be moving towards wanting to fix himself and his life, this hadn't involved him cutting out alcohol completely, a move that was clearly necessary given all the trouble it had brought him. And this decision to keep booze in his life would see him arrested again, although this time for a relatively minor incident at a nightclub in which an interaction with a fan would somehow get heated and result in Mayhem Miller putting the fan in a headlock and choking him before trying to flee the nightclub when police were called. Compared to the other stuff he had done, this wasn't really a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but it appears on the face of it that this minor offense may have been the one to truly give him the kick up the ass he needed to fix his life, and crucially, go completely sober. In the aftermath of this latest arrest, Miller would release a lengthy statement to his Instagram detailing the struggles of his life and the failure to get things back on track, and how much his behaviors and addictions had taken a toll on not just him, but those closest to him. He conceded that previously he'd viewed seeking help as weakness, but now he realized it might be the only thing that could save him from this destructive spiral, and this is something that he has reiterated on podcasts.
The worst word in my head was sobriety. The worst word in my head was rehab. That was for weak people. I thought because I was strong-minded that I could do whatever and just figure it out on my own. But
along with his Instagram post, Miller shared a selfie in which it was clear the toll his vices and chaotic life was taking on him. Hardly recognizable compared to an interview from just 4 years ago. This picture and arrest occurred in September of 2023, and Mayhem would take the step of entering rehab for his addictions that same month, but not before what he claims was a life-altering moment that gave him the jolt needed to take serious action. His enough is enough moment came after getting kicked out of a group home he was staying at for pissing on a rug while drunk.
Where I just wandered, I was like, okay, enough's enough. And I tried to go to a rehab. The rehab intake closed at 7 o'clock, I think. And I showed up at 7:30 and the doors were locked. And I was like, So I wandered around. And buddy, I went to prison for a couple of years, but I went down to Skid Row for about 16 minutes. And I was never more nervous in my life than that moment. I saw this is what's next, buddy. If you keep up like this, so everybody has their weird.
Since this moment and Mayhem's stint in rehab, there has been no news of any further arrests. Even better than no arrests, it seems like he may finally be getting his act together after many false dawns, having taken the step of finally giving up alcohol and going fully sober, accepting that a healthy relationship with alcohol was for him just not possible, in much the same way as it hadn't been for his father.
I'm sure there's a genetic component to it. I'm not a scientist, but I will say, like, okay, for years, hated my dad pretty much. Hated him. And it's weird that it drove me in my career to fight better. Kind of, you know, like it just, every day I was kind of whooping my dad's ass. In a little, yeah, I focused that energy, this kind of, because I was mad because my dad, you know, he had drinking problems and was like kind of a monster in my youth. And it made me mad. And I always in my head, I'm like, I'm never going to be like that. Never gonna. And so,
prior to his life going off the rails, there was an army of people who would have testified to Miller's character as a genuine and nice person with a crazy but not malicious side, with many of those he interacted with during his life of training, teaching, and hosting Bully Beatdown coming away with a very positive impression. But that version of Mayhem Miller had been lost in the haze of his alcohol and drug abuse that burnt bridges and ruined his image. It seemed extremely unlikely at some points that Mayhem would ever become that same genuine and likable guy again. But after this latest spell in rehab, there just seems to be something different about him. Compared to the worn out, battle-scarred, and struggling face we saw in the selfie posted alongside his apology after his latest arrest, he looks considerably younger and fresher in less than a year, and he has replaced his toxic habits with wholesome pursuits like delving back into coaching, which is something he has always taken naturally to. Additionally, these days he is involved in an organization providing support to veterans stuck in a similar what do I do now predicament after their military careers have ended. It's impossible to say whether or not Mayhem Miller is truly reformed, and for some people, battling against these addictions is a lifelong fight that never truly ends. But there is big reason for optimism that one of MMA's most colorful characters may have finally ended this dark chapter of his life and turned over a new leaf, with a renewed purpose and perspective on what is really important. The purpose of the justice system is to rehabilitate criminals and give them another chance at life. And although Mayhem Miller's past is something he cannot change, I truly believe that there is a good person in there somewhere if he can overcome his demons, stay sober, and focus on helping others. After a life defined by mayhem to this point, hopefully the next few decades of Jason Miller's life can be just a little bit more normal. The end. If you got this far, thank you so much for watching, and please drop a like to help the channel. If you enjoyed this video, then check out my last video on the cartel boss who took over boxing. And if you enjoy football or American football, check out my other channels linked in the description below. Peace.